If you found the content of these videos helpful, then please click subscribe and like the video so that others might find the content helpful as well. Well, we've made it to the end of our journey through Acts 20, looking at Paul's address to the Ephesian elders, just looking at these final 3 verses here, which I have called Keep Going, and specifically to the nations, to all nations. As always, and perhaps even specifically now that we come to the end of this section, it'll be helpful for you to read through the whole lot and pray that God would remind you of what we've seen the whole way through this section and how all of these strings can get pulled together in how Luke ends off this chapter. As I've worked through this section, the way I've divided it up is just looking at verse 36, then 37 and the first half of 38, and in just this final little bit. And what I saw in here is, firstly we see Paul praying, so there's a focus on his praying to God, his Father. Then we see a real deep love between Paul and these Ephesian elders as they weep and embrace and kiss him, and they are grieving that they will never see his face again. And then finally, Paul leaves them. They accompany him to the ship. And then chapter 21 begins as well. 21 verse 1 says, after we had torn ourselves away from them. So again, you just you get a real sense for the deep love that these Ephesians and Paul had for each other. And just seeing, so Paul said all of these incredible things, he's taught them so much, and then it says when he had finished speaking, he knelt down with all of them. So together they are praying. And what I saw here is this is just showing Paul's great love for God. He is committing himself, he's committing them, he's committing his journey ahead, he's committing all that he's taught them to God. And there's a real example that he would have wanted them to follow, praying, committing themselves to God, showing their love for God. And just imagine Paul praying in the light of all that he's taught them. He would have been praying them to be those who, praying for himself and for them, that they would be those who live the truth as it impacts their hearts, their hands and their heads. He would have been praying that they would continue to proclaim the truth. So he hasn't hesitated to preach, teach, declare. And here he models that he wanted to finish this task of testifying to the good news of God's grace. So he wanted to take the risks, the necessary risks of going to Jerusalem. He knew that hardship was coming, but he wanted to proclaim the gospel of God's grace. And just imagine that fueling his prayers. So he's praying that he and they would live the truth, that he and they would keep proclaiming the gospel of God's grace, that they would stick to the whole truth, being beware of wolves who will distort the truth, but that they would be those who proclaim the whole will of God. Sticking to the whole truth, nothing added, nothing taken away. And that as he committed them in words to God and to the word of his grace, in prayer he would have been doing that as well, thanking God for his abundant generosity to them and praying that they would then be abundant in generosity with all that God has given them. So his prayer, I would imagine, kind of summarizes all that he had taught them that day. But what it is showing is this deep love for God. Then we see that flows into a deep love for each other. So this love for God flows into them weeping and embracing, kissing, grieving that they're not going to see each other again. It really shows a tight familial love between Paul and these Ephesian elders, and that is how it should be with us as the church family. There should be a real deep love. As Jesus said, it is by our love for each other that the world will know that we are his disciples. And for example, in 1 Thessalonians, we see Paul speaking of his deep love for them, as he was gentle, like a mother among them, sharing not only the gospel but his very life with them. And as a father among them, he taught them and encouraged them so that they might keep going. So Paul speaks of his love, and here we just see it on display. There was a real deep love between Paul and these Ephesian elders. That love flowed first and foremost out of his love for God. And then Paul left them. And I think what this shows us is Paul's love for the lost. Paul wanted to keep going. In Acts 9, when Paul was commissioned, God said to Ananias that Paul was his chosen instrument to proclaim the gospel among the Gentiles. And here we see Paul wanting to continue with that task. He's going, leaving his much loved Ephesian brothers, but he's going because there are much loved people who still need to hear about Jesus. So this final little section, kind of pulling all of these truths together, these gospel essentials, show that actually these gospel essentials all flow out of a deep love for God. That love will then be shown in a deep love for each other within this family, and it must naturally flow that we have a deep love for the lost, for those who don't yet know Jesus as Lord and Savior and King. And so in teaching this, I want to push all of those, that actually we need to be those who love God, love each other, and love the lost. But we're not going to get that right if this isn't right. This really is the starting point. Everything else that Paul says here flows from the fact that he prayed to God, he committed himself to God, he trusted God, he loved God. And it was that love that had fueled him right in the beginning to go to Ephesus. And that love then grew a deep bond between him and these Ephesian elders. They really loved each other deeply. But it was also his deep love for God, his wonder at what God had done for him, that he wanted to keep going to the lost, to finish the task that God had given him. And so I pray that in your opportunities teaching this, that all of these things will be talking points. How can we deepen our love for God? Remembering the truth, remembering the gospel of God's grace, wanting to live as those who are impacted by these gospel essentials. And as our love for each other, our love for God grows, it will flow into a deepening love for each other. But that should then naturally flow into a deepening love for the lost. We don't want to just be a church family who love each other a lot, but who don't care for a world who are dying without Jesus. And we want our love for God to flow out of us, that others would know that love. We want our love for each other to be seen by the world, and so that others would want to be a part of what they see in us, all because of our love for God. We want to see the lost saved. And so I pray that as you teach this, as you see Paul driven to keep going in the mission that he's given, that it would drive us as Christians to be those who love the lost around us and who want them to know Jesus. So as you wrap this up, as you teach it to others, may this truth really stir us, that we would be those who have a much deepening, growing love for God that impacts all of our lives. Well, God bless as you continue your journey through this section in Acts 20. May it impact you, and may you then faithfully teach it to others, that many more would know these gospel essentials and live in the light of them, so that lives would be transformed, that the world would be impacted by the good news of Jesus, and ultimately so that our great God would be glorified through us. Well, God bless as you teach this to others. If you found the content of these videos helpful, then please click subscribe and like the video so that others might find the content helpful as well.